Hey, how's it going guys? My name is Dom and today we're going to be using Vue 3 to create a responsive gauge component which looks just like this. As you can see, it's animated and you're able to of course update the value of the gauge through a standard prop. So let's go inside this tab right here and begin from scratch to create what I just showed you. Now, I am going to be using Vite as my build tool, but of course you can use whatever build tool you like. But the main point is I've got this component called gauge.vue and I'm simply importing this into the main app. So I'm going to assume that you have a similar setup on your end. If not, just simply create a new Vite project with Vue selected and delete all of the boilerplates and you should be good to go. So once you have the gauge component in your file structure, we're going to be good to create the component. So the first thing to do here is going to be to head inside gauge.vue and we're going to define a property for the percentage. So going up to the top section here within the setup, we can begin by declaring the props. So we can say const props equal to and then use define props. And within here, we can of course pass through and define our single property, which of course is going to be the percentage. So let's say percentage just like this, and this prop is going to have a type of number and it's also going to be required. So this right here, like I said, is the only prop we're going to need for the gauge. And of course, it can be updated by the parent. In this case here, it's going to be app.vue. So we're done with the props. We can now move on to the HTML itself. Now, the HTML for this gauge is actually going to be from one of my older videos. So if you're interested in the vanilla HTML, CSS, JavaScript solution of this, you can check that one out. But all of the logic and the way the CSS works is going to be the exact same. So the way it's going to work is we're going to have a div here, which is going to be the outer section for the gauge. So let's make a new div with a class of gauge underscore outer, just like this. And within here, we can also create an inner div. So we can say here gauge underscore inner. So I'm going to stop right here and jump to the CSS so we can actually see some progress in the browser. So when it comes to the CSS for this gauge, we can begin by targeting the gauge underscore outer class. And for this one, we're going to be setting the width and the max width. And this here is key to making it responsive. So I'm going to say here width 100% and max width 250px. Now I'm going to save this and go back in the browser here, and we can see that if I was to inspect the actual code here, we have the gauge right there. Now it's 250px wide, but the point here is if I was to resize the browser down, so I'll just zoom in here. If I resize the browser down, the actual gauge is going to shrink with my my browser width. So this right here is key to it being responsive. I'll show you this more visually very shortly, but we're going to jump back into here now and also target the gauge underscore inner class. So this inner class is going to inherit many of the properties from the parent. So we're going to say here a width of 100%. We're going to say a height of 0. Now, we're going to be using some CSS trickery to have the height half the size as the width. So we can do this by saying a padding bottom of 50%. And of course the height of 0. So now if I set the background color to be something like a dark green gray, being B4C0BE, I'll save this, go back in the browser here, we get this right here, okay? Now, we can see that the height is going to be half the width, and that's done using that padding right there, which I just showed you, of 50%. So that's how we can achieve that. And again, if I was to resize down, we can see the gauge also resizes down with us. So we're now going to see how the gauge is going to work and how we can use CSS to actually make it look like a gauge. So let's move on by adding a position of relative here. This is going to be useful for centering the text. I'll show you this later on, but more importantly, a border top left radius here of 100% and then 200%. Let's do the exact same thing for the right side. And what these two properties here are going to do is they're going to give us a semicircle. Let's go back in the browser and we get just that right there. So we can see that border radius applies a semicircle, and now it's looking like a gauge a little bit more. Let's also provide an overflow of hidden. This here is going to be useful for later on. So I'm going to comment this line out. However, we are going to be including that back in towards the end of this video. So let's keep it there for now. I'll show you why it's useful later on. We can now move on to a few more divs inside the gauge HTML. So we're now going to need a fill. We can say gauge __ fill. And for this one here, we can target the class of gauge __ fill. And this is going to be the main green fill that you saw from the demo. This one right here, that's moving. So going back inside here, how it's going to work is it's going to have a position of absolute, okay? And this also comes in handy with the position relative that we set for the gauge inner, because now any positioning data we give is going to be based off the parent. That being said, let's have the top of 100% and a left of 0. This here is going to push this fill down to the bottom underneath the inner. Okay, let's also give this a width of inherit and a height of 100%. I'm also going to give this a background of 009578. That is my decode green color. I'm going to stop here and show you how it looks. Let's go back in the browser here and we get this right here. So if I was to inspect the element, we have the gauge fill. We're using the top of 100%, which is going to push that all the way down to the bottom of the inner. Then using the width of 100% or inherit and the height of 100%, we're able to then essentially have the fill the exact same dimensions as the inner, which is going to be useful for actually making that gauge go up and down. And I'm going to show you how that works right now. So essentially, what's going to happen is we're going to be using the transform rotate CSS feature to rotate this square along the center axis right here. So what we need to do is actually we need to take this square, right, and we need to say that we want to actually rotate it on the top pivot point right here. And that means that it's going to sort of give us that constant rotation across the semicircle. So let me show you this visually. It's going to make a lot more sense. So going back inside here now, we're going to say a transform origin of center and then top. So the center top of the actual fill, the rectangle, right? Then we're going to say a transform here of rotate, then 0.25 of a turn. Okay, we're now also going to say a transition of transform at 0.2 seconds, then an ease out. So of course, this transition line just makes it so it's going to be animated when you change the gauge percentage. So going back inside the browser here, we can see we have this. So we have this center point, this center pivot point. Any rotations we apply happens on that center point. If I was to go inside the CSS here and just change the turn from 0.25 to just 0.15, we can see even now it's rotating. So as we increase that value and decrease that value, it's going to rotate across the center. And this here, of course, is key to getting the gauge to work. Now, let me stop right here and move back to the overflow hidden. Let's put that line back in, and you'll see now upon saving, we have essentially every part of the fill that isn't, is outside of the bounds of the semicircle is going to be hidden. And this here is also critical to getting our gauge to look like a gauge. So we have that right there. Let's now go back inside VS Code here and just put that overflow hidden back in here, because I'm going to show you a bit more now in terms of the text and getting that to work, and we can visualize that better with the without the hidden overflow. So we have this right here. Let's now work on the actual inner bit with the text and making it a full-on, gauge. So going back inside VS Code here, let's have the last element called gauge underscore underscore cover. So this is going to be like a little bit of a cover over the entire thing right now. So let's target that gauge underscore underscore cover. And of course, the cover is also going to include the text. So for this one here, we're going to give it a width of 75% and a height of 150%. I'm going to explain why we have these values very shortly, but I'm also going to have a background here of just red for now. I'll save this, go back in the browser, and we get this right here. We can't see it. Interesting. Let's expand this and see if we can see the cover right there. So I may have forgotten to include something here. Let's have a look. I might actually include, did I spell this correctly? Gauge cover. I sure did. Okay, let's just include a position of absolute here and a top of 25% and a left of 50% just to see if I can get this thing to display. I'll refresh and there we go. So that's interesting that we're getting something like this here. Okay, so it turns out everything's perfectly fine. We just had the cover hidden behind the green fill. So the point here is that we have this cover, which is now a perfect square. The reason why it's a perfect square is because we set the width to be 75%, and this is 75% of the gauge outer, okay? So we then have a height of 150%. As you remember, the outer, the height of that is going to be half of what the width is. So by setting the height of 150, we get the exact same value as the width, giving us a perfect square. Once we have this perfect square right here, as we can see, we then are using some positioning values here just to move it to the side, and that's all that's doing. So we can see it's in the on the right side there, so that's what that top and 25% is. If I was to move this down, we can see it's decreasing and increasing, on the y-axis. So that's what that's doing. Now let me quickly show you the demo, because the demo explains it a lot better than what I'm going to do. So if I was to inspect the cover here, we can see that the reason why I chose 75% is because we want to leave 25% of space on the left and right. Divide that by 2 and you get 12.5% on each side. So that 12.5% is what gives us that space for the fill, as we can kind of see right there on those left and right of the actual cover. So that's why we chose 75%. Now that we have this left of 50% and the top of 25, we can now use transform and say translate X to then shift that back -50%, and this here is going to position it in the center. Let's save this back in the browser and we can see it's centered right there. So now the last step is going to be to, of course, convert this into a circle. We can do this by using a border radius of 50%. I'll save this back in the browser and we get this right here. And we can see it all coming together now. So going back inside here, let's make the background to be white. So triple F right there. And the last step now is going to simply to include that hidden overflow. I'll save this back in the browser and we get this right here. So the gauge appears to be displaying like a gauge and it looks really good. So the last step for the CSS and the HTML is going to be to have the text be displayed. So for this one, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to be having the text inside the cover itself. So let's just put here for now 50%. Okay, I'll save this, then go back down inside the gauge cover CSS. I'll make a section for the text here, and I'm going to say for the text a display of flex, a align items of center, and also a justify content of center. And this here on the cover is going to make sure that anything inside of it is going to be displayed in the dead center. And we can also have a padding bottom here, a padding bottom of 25%. I'll save this, go back in the browser, and we get the percentage right there. So this here doesn't look very good. That's because we forgot a box sizing. Let's include a box sizing here of border box. I'll save this back in the browser and the text now displays correctly. The reason for that bottom padding is because if I don't include that, we can see the text goes in the middle, exactly in the middle. But to push it up a little bit, we're going to use padding bottom. And there we go, it's now relatively in the center. So that's why we're using that padding bottom there. And we can now apply some basic styles to the text, so changing the font and things like that. We can say a font family. I'm going to use the Lexend font as well as a sans serif. I'm also going to use a font weight of bold and a font size of 32 pixels. Of course, this here is totally up to you. I'll save this, go back in the browser, and we get this right here. So that is all for the HTML and the CSS within this component for the gauge. So now we're going to move on to the JavaScript and the logic to, of course, get the gauge to fill up and also display that percentage. So going back to the percentage prop, let's actually pass that prop in. So going back inside the app.view here, let's now provide that prop, and we can say a percentage of, let's just do 50 to start off with, okay? I'll save this, and now of course, going inside the Vue DevTools here, we're going to have that percentage be applied as the prop, and we can now of course use that percentage within the HTML template. So within here, using the double curly braces, let's just say percentage and then say .toFixed and pass in here 0. So this just means we're going to output the percentage provided as a prop and then use the toFixed to ensure it remains as a whole number. Let's save this, go back in the browser here, and we get 50%. Going back inside app.view, let's just make this 25 to confirm it works. I'll save this, go back in the browser, and it does indeed work. Cool. So we have the percentage being displayed. If you were to, for example, apply 25.23, I'll save it. We still get 25. And of course, that right there is due to the toFixed of 0 that we used inside the template. So moving on now, let's keep it as a 0.23 just to make sure it works properly. Then go inside the gauge.view, and from here, we need to then, of course, apply that percentage as part of the gauge fill. So we're going to be using inline styles for this one. We're going to say style using the view object here. And within this object, we are going to want to use, again, the transform property. Basically, we want to do the same thing that we did down here in the gauge fill, but of course make that inline style instead. As a default, let's set it to be 0 turn. This way, it's going to start on the bottom. Now, it's important to mention that 0.5 of a turn is actually the entire gauge filled up. So if I provide 100 as the percentage, this needs to be 0.5, and this means we need to do some division by 2 to translate the 100 into a 0.5. Okay, let's explore that right now. Let's set the rotation to be 0 turn, go back to the top here, and for this transform value, we're just going to simply say rotate once again. Then within here, we're going to pass in a computed property. Now we're going to call this computed property, we're going to call it CSS transform rotate value. So a bit of a long name there, but it's descriptive. It's exactly what it is. It is the transform rotate value. So let's now define this computed value. We can do this by using const CSS transform rotate value equal to, and then use the computed function here. Now, within this, we're going to provide a function, and the return value of this is going to be the value for this computed value. So within here, what are we going to do? Well, we need to use the percentage that was passed in as a prop. Okay, so for this, we're going to say, firstly, const percentage as fraction. So if you pass in 100, we actually want that to be 1. So we're going to say here props.percentage divided by 100. Let's now just return this percentage as fraction just to see what we get. I'll save this and then go back in the browser here. And inside the gauge component, we get right here the computed property, and it's 0.2523. Of course, that right there is the divide by 100 of the percentage, okay? So we have this. Now, once we have this value, we now need to simply divide that by 2. We're going to say const half percentage equal to percentage as fraction divided by 2. And now we have this value. We can provide that to the turn within the rotate. So we'll say here return, then use template strings, and we're going to say half percentage, then turn just like that. I'll save this, and now we're going to get this here inside the rotate. Save this, go back in the browser, and we get that percentage being displayed right there. It's 25.23. That's 0.12615 of a turn. That's the equivalent, right? If I go back in the app and I make this 100, we should see, of course, 0.5. I'll go back in the browser. That's filled up. And of course, we get 0.5 as the CSS value. So that's how it's going to work. And that's basically it. So of course, the last step is going to be to use this gauge, and you may want to, of course, have your state managed inside your main app as the parent and update the gauge value as you progress and change the data within your application. So that right there is how to create a gauge component using Vue 3 and the composition API. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like this one, make sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.